Elena's eyes opened to the sound of the fire extinguisher hissing in the parking garage, the white chemical powder coating her face like snow. But that moment came later. First came the cold mattress. First came the bank statement. First came the moment she saw the man with the lead pipe swinging toward Julian's ribs. First came the knife in Marcus's hand. First came the choice to stay with her husband when the timer showed Era1. That moment in the cabin, wrapped around Julian as the seconds ticked toward zero, would redefine everything she thought she knew about devotion, sacrifice, and the price of survival. But it all began on an overcast morning, 5 hours before the garage. It all began with an empty pillow. Elena's eyes snapped open at 5:30 a.m. The charcoal gray silk sheets were cool against her left side, but the right side of the king bed lay perfectly flat, undisturbed. The pillow beside her held no indent from a head, no warmth. She reached across the mattress anyway, her fingers extending into the cold space. The air conditioning unit hummed somewhere in the walls, and her breath came visible in the chilly bedroom. She exhaled slowly, pushing the thick cream-colored wool cardigan over her silk nightgown. Her feet touched the hardwood floor. In the corner of the room, Julian's mahogany desk sat facing the window, and on its polished surface lay a single white envelope, A5 size, its face pressed down against the wood. Elena walked to it, her slippers making soft sounds on the floor. She flipped the envelope over with trembling fingers. There was no sender's mark, no postage stamp, just the paper itself, the kind used for official mail. Inside was a folded bank statement from Starlight Bank. The pages rustled as she unfolded them. Her eyes moved across the columns of transactions, scanning through deposits and charges, until she reached the withdrawals section. 3 transactions stood out, marked with red circles in what looked like a pen that had been pressed down hard enough to nearly tear the paper. 3 withdrawals of exactly $2,000 each to something called Apex Recovery Services. $6,000 in a single month. She pressed her thumb into the statement, wrinkling the paper deliberately. The lines on her forehead deepened. She dropped the paper on the desk and walked to the window, pulling the blind string downward. The blinds clattered open. Outside, a black Audi sat in the driveway. The engine was off, but exhaust was still puffing from the tailpipe in thin white clouds into the cold air. Through the rear window, she could make out a silhouette slumped against the steering wheel. "Not again, Julian. Not today," she whispered, the words barely audible even to herself. She turned from the window and went back to the nightstand, grabbing her phone. The call log showed 14 outgoing calls to Julian's contact between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. 14, all unanswered. Her thumb swiped across the screen and the log history disappeared. A single haptic click confirmed the deletion. Elena walked across the wet concrete of the driveway, her slippers soaking up water. The morning was cold enough that her breath came in visible puffs. She reached the driver's side door of the Audi and pulled the handle hard. It opened with a heavy thud against the stop. "Out, now," she said, her voice commanding and sharp. Julian's eyes opened slowly, glassy and distant. He had been asleep, or something close to it. His jaw was stubbled, his shirt was wrinkled, and under his left eye was a fresh bruise, the skin a dark purple that hadn't been there yesterday. Julian fumbled with the center console, his movements frantic. Elena saw his hands moving toward something, a small brown leather pouch barely visible in the shadows. She lunged across him, her hands clawing for the bag. Julian pushed her back with his forearm, his elbow striking her shoulder hard. "Get off me! It's nothing!" He slurred, his voice thick and defensive. Elena grabbed his wrist with both hands, twisting it downward with all her strength. He snarled and shoved her with his shoulder, a brutal push that sent her reeling backward. Her hip struck the concrete driveway with a dull thud that knocked the air from her lungs. She gasped, unable to breathe for a moment, her hand scraping against the rough ground. Skin tore. Blood welled up along her palm. Julian stepped out of the car, looking down at her. For a moment he stood there. Then his hand opened. The leather pouch fell to the ground and split open as it hit the wet concrete. 3 thick bundles of $100 bills tied with rubber bands rolled out across the driveway. Not drugs. Cash. Lots of it. The bright green of the money stood out against the gray stone. "I'm trying to fix it, Elena. I'm trying to pay them back," Julian said, his voice cracking with something that sounded like shame and desperation mixed together. Elena pushed herself up, nursing her elbow. She looked at the money, then at Julian. She reached up toward the bruise under his eye, but he flinched away, stepping back into the car door. The metal made a hollow sound when his back struck it. "Who hit you? And where did this money come from?" she asked, her voice low and trembling. Julian didn't answer. He just stared at the money on the ground, his shoulders shaking slightly in the cold morning air. By 7 a.m., Elena was in the kitchen, a glass of water in her hand, watching the marble counter where Julian's phone sat. It had been vibrating every few minutes since he rushed upstairs to shower. Messages kept coming in from an unsaved number. The latest one made her set down the glass carefully. A message appeared on the lock screen. "The clock is ticking. We know where she is." Elena picked up the phone. The back casing was slightly loose, easy to pry open with a butter knife. Behind the battery, taped with electrical tape, was a micro GPS chip with a blinking red LED. Not a manufacturer's component. Not anything legitimate. She took the chip and walked to the sink. She dropped it into the garbage disposal, flipped the switch. The grinding sound filled the kitchen as the plastic and circuitry were pulverized. Water swirled down the drain, carrying fragments of the device with it. The "she" in that message. It referred to her. Elena looked at her reflection in the stainless steel refrigerator. She looked pale. Older than she should. The face staring back at her was not the face of someone whose husband had a wandering eye. It was the face of someone who was being hunted. Julian entered the kitchen wearing a fresh business suit, but he looked like a ghost. He walked immediately to the counter, reaching for his phone. Elena slid it toward him across the marble. The back casing was roughly pressed back on, not fitting quite right. "Your friend sent you a message," Elena said, her voice ice cold. "They're coming for me now, aren't they?" Julian's hand froze on the phone. He didn't pick it up. He just stood there, staring at it. "Aren't they?" Elena repeated. His shoulders sagged. He pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down heavily, as if his legs could no longer support his weight. He still didn't answer, but the answer was written all over his face. At 5:30 p.m., Julian parked his car 2 blocks from an underground parking garage in the financial district. He had told Elena he was going to a business meeting, but she knew better now. She knew he was going to meet with someone, to make a payment, to try to buy time. She followed him, staying 20 paces back, and when he descended into the garage, she descended after him, hiding behind thick concrete pillars as his footsteps echoed against the concrete. Julian stopped near a gray van with tinted windows. The van had its engine running. 2 men in dark hoodies stepped out from behind a parked SUV. One of them carried a heavy lead pipe. Julian raised the leather pouch of money like it could shield him from what was about to happen. The man with the pipe swung it in a wide arc. The metal connected with Julian's ribs with a dull crack that Elena heard even from her position behind the pillar. Julian collapsed onto the pavement, gasping, and the attacker raised the pipe again. Elena ran from behind the pillar. She grabbed the red fire extinguisher from its wall mount, its weight familiar in her hands from the old police training. She swung it with all her strength, and the heavy canister slammed into the side of the attacker's head with a metallic clang. He spun and fell hard onto the ground. The second attacker moved toward Julian. Elena pulled the pin on the fire extinguisher and squeezed the handle. A blast of white chemical powder shot across the space, hitting the man directly in the face. He staggered back, coughing and blind, his hands clawing at his eyes. "Get to the car! Move!" Elena screamed. She hauled Julian up, his arms slung across her shoulders. They scrambled into her smaller SUV, and she slammed it into reverse. The tires screeched against the concrete as she accelerated hard. In the rearview mirror, the first attacker was back on his feet. He grabbed the lead pipe and hurled it at them. The rear passenger window exploded into a million tiny cubes of safety glass. The pipe had come within inches of Elena's head. She didn't slow down. She took the ramp out of the garage at dangerous speed. And only when they were on the main road did she finally breathe. They drove for 2 hours without speaking. Elena finally turned off onto a small dirt road that climbed into the mountains. The cabin appeared through the trees, old, dilapidated, with a tin roof that looked like it might cave in under the right pressure. It was a place Julian had mentioned once, years ago. A property his family owned. Nobody went there anymore. She helped Julian inside. He collapsed on a moth-eaten sofa, and she wrapped duct tape around his ribs over a clean bandage. His skin was dark with bruising. By 9 p.m., heavy rain was drumming on the tin roof, and Julian was asleep, his breathing shallow and pained. Elena sat at a dusty wooden table, searching through Julian's briefcase. In a hidden flap, she found a black moleskin notebook. Inside were photographs. Her own photographs. From 10 years ago. One showed her in a police uniform she had never told Julian about. Her hair shorter, her face harder. The handwriting beneath the photo read, "They found the file on the Miller case. They know she kept the evidence." She turned the page. Every withdrawal she had assumed was a gambling debt was listed carefully, with dates and amounts and the name Vain written beside each one. But below the numbers, in cursive handwriting that she recognized as Julian's, was a note. "Must keep her safe. If she knows I know, she'll run. I can't lose her like I lost Sarah." Elena looked at Julian sleeping on the sofa. His face was peaceful in sleep, but ravaged in wakefulness. All the resentment she had felt for his emotional distance, his secrecy, his strange absences, it all crystallized into a single awful truth. He wasn't keeping secrets from her. He was keeping her safe from them. He had been standing between her and her past all along, paying for a sins she had committed a decade ago when she was still a police officer. When she had found evidence of corruption so deep and so damaging that she had hidden it instead of reporting it. She went to the window. In the distance, headlights were moving up the muddy track toward the cabin, maybe 5 minutes away. Elena reached into the briefcase and pulled out the gun. A Smith & Wesson snub-nosed revolver, heavy and cold in her palm. "They're here," she said quietly to the sleeping man. Elena ran through the dense pine trees, branches whipping her face as she moved deeper into the woods. She carried a bright LED flashlight, waving it deliberately to draw attention. She could hear footsteps behind her, 3 sets, maybe more. She was faster than she looked. She had been faster her whole life. She tripped over a root and slid down a muddy embankment into darkness. One of the attackers jumped after her, landing hard. Elena rolled onto her back and kicked upward. Her heel connected with the man's groin. He doubled over, gasping. Elena scrambled to her feet. The man grabbed her hair from behind, pulling her backward. She reached down into the mud, found a heavy stone, and bashed it against his knuckles. He screamed and released her. A hunting knife fell from his hand as he fell back, and Elena grabbed it without thinking, the grip still warm from his palm. The second attacker tackled her from the side. They tumbled together into a shallow stream. Elena used the momentum to force him under the water. She pushed down on his chest with all her weight, holding him beneath the surface. He thrashed, water spraying everywhere. Elena felt the cold of the stream against her skin. She felt nothing else. After a long moment, his thrashing stopped. The water continued to move around them, carrying away the moment like it had never happened. Elena pulled herself out of the stream, her entire body shaking from cold and exertion. She looked back toward the cabin, where all was now quiet. She hid the knife in her waistband and began the long trek back, her heart hammering against her ribs with each step. The cabin doors opened onto a scene Elena's mind struggled to process. Marcus was sitting in a kitchen chair with his service weapon, a Glock 17, pointed directly at Julian's head. Julian was tied to the sofa with duct tape, his face pale, his eyes wild with panic. Marcus was her former partner. They had worked the Miller case together 10 years ago. He had been the one to suggest that sometimes the evidence was more valuable kept safe than released to a corrupt department. "You always were good in the woods, El," Marcus said, his voice conversational and cold. "Took out 2 of my best guys." He tossed a file onto the table. "I don't have them," Elena said, her voice steady as a lie. "I burned the location years ago. This notebook was the only map left." Marcus roared. He lunged at her, swinging his gun in a vicious arc meant to pistol whip her face. Elena ducked. The heavy metal clipped her ear, sending white-hot pain across her head. Blood immediately stained her collar, and she fell. Elena grabbed Marcus's ankle and twisted with all her strength. He fell forward hard, his chin connecting with the edge of the wooden table. He groaned, dropping his gun. Both of them scrambled for it as it slid across the floor, finally coming to rest under the oven, just out of reach. Marcus recovered faster. He pinned Elena against the fireplace, pressing her face toward the flames. Elena felt the heat on her skin, felt her eyebrows beginning to singe. She reached blindly behind her for the iron poker that was supposed to be on the hearth. Her fingers found it. She pulled it toward her and swung with both hands. The poker connected with Marcus's ribs. Once, twice. He wheezed and fell back. Elena didn't stop. She hit him in the knee next, and the sound that came from him was something between a scream and an animal's cry. His leg bent at an angle that made Elena's stomach twist. Marcus pulled a knife from an ankle holster and stabbed Elena in the thigh. She gasped, pain exploding through her leg. They were both bleeding now, both wounded, both operating on nothing but survival instinct. Elena crawled toward him and grabbed his hair, slamming his face into the floor repeatedly. Marcus's struggles became weaker. After the 4th impact, his body went limp. Elena dragged herself to the sofa. The timer showed 00:45. She tried to tear through the duct tape around Julian's wrists, but the hunting knife she had used in the woods was too dull from its contact with bone. The tape wouldn't tear. She looked at the timer, 00:15, then 00:10. Julian was looking at her, tears in his eyes, shaking his head. He was trying to tell her to run, to leave him, to save herself. Elena dropped the knife. Instead of running, she climbed onto the sofa and wrapped her arms around him from behind, burying her face in his neck. She gripped his restrained hands with hers. 005, 004, 003. Elena closed her eyes tight. She felt Julian lean his head back against hers. They were completely still. 01, 0. A mechanical click sounded from beneath the sofa. Then nothing. No explosion. The red display just began flashing zeros endlessly. Elena opened her eyes slowly. She looked down at the C4. The blocks were made of painted wood. The whole thing had been a fake, designed by Marcus to terrify them into a confession. She looked over and saw Marcus's eye twitch. His fingers were beginning to move. Elena finally managed to cut through Julian's duct tape using a shard of glass from the shattered window. He fell forward into her arms, gasping in pain from his injured side. She helped him stand, supporting most of his weight. Before leaving, Elena grabbed Marcus's phone from his pocket. The recording app was running, had been running the entire time. He had been recording everything. She pressed save and watched the progress bar climb, uploading the evidence to the cloud. 100%. She took the iron poker and jammed it through the handles of the front door, locking Marcus inside the cabin. She and Julian limped out to the garage where Marcus's pristine Range Rover was parked. Julian found the keys in the ignition. The engine roared to life. Elena collapsed into the passenger seat and looked back at the cabin. Through the front window, she could see Marcus's bloody face, his hands slamming against the glass, his mouth opening and closing in silent screams. Julian took her hand and squeezed it. For the first time since this nightmare began, Elena didn't pull away. She squeezed back. As they drove away, the cabin grew smaller behind them, and the silence between them was no longer one of distance and secrets. It was something else entirely, something raw and broken and genuine. By 4 a.m., they were in a small motel room off a highway whose name Elena didn't know. She was in the bathroom, stitching her thigh wound with needle and thread from a travel kit. The needle went in and out, in and out. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. She looked like a stranger. She reached for the small silver locket that hung around her neck, the one she had worn for 10 years. She popped the back open with a tweezer's tip. Behind the photo of her and Julian on their wedding day was a tiny micro SD card. It contained the original evidence from the Miller case, the digital ledger that had led to Marcus's arrest just hours after they uploaded it to the cloud. Not diamonds. Never diamonds. Elena stepped back into the motel room. Julian was sitting on the bed, staring at the television. The news showed Marcus being led away in handcuffs. His suit was torn, his face was bruised, his leg was wrapped in an emergency splint. Elena walked over and showed him the micro SD card. "The diamonds never existed, Julian," she said quietly. "I let them think they did so I'd have leverage. But I never knew you were paying them for my life." Julian looked at her, and then slowly began to laugh. A dry, hacking sound that seemed to surprise both of them. He shook his head and pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. Inside was a ring with an empty center setting, the prongs standing open and waiting. "I was going to ask you to start over," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. "I spent the last of our savings on the setting. I just needed the jewel." Elena took the micro SD card and dropped it into the empty setting. It fit perfectly. She slid the ring onto her finger and looked at it. The black chip caught the light like a stone. "It's the most expensive thing we own," Elena said. "Let's go home." The ocean was gray-blue and vast. Elena and Julian stood at the edge of a cliff overlooking the Atlantic, the wind strong enough to blow her hair across her face. Julian had his arm wrapped around her waist, supporting some of her weight. The sun was breaking through the clouds, illuminating the water below. The waves crashed against the rocks with a sound like thunder. Elena looked at the ring on her finger. She took it off slowly and held it over the edge. She looked at Julian. He nodded once, understanding without words what needed to happen. She let go. The ring fell, spinning in the light before disappearing into the white foam below. Julian kissed Elena's forehead. He looked down at her with eyes that finally saw her, not as a target to protect, but as a partner. The distance between them was gone. They turned away from the cliff and walked back toward the rental car, a simple, beat-up vehicle that asked no questions. They moved slowly, two wounded people supporting each other, leaving the carnage and the secrets behind them. "Where to?" Julian asked, his voice quiet. "Doesn't matter," Elena said. "Just away from here." They drove away from the cliff without looking back. The gravel crunched beneath the car's tires. The ocean faded into the distance. On the mud where they had stood, a single blood-stained bandage had fallen. The sun hit it, turning the red to a bright, vibrant crimson as the last light of day painted the cliffside in shades of gold and amber. The wind continued to blow. The waves continued to crash. The bandage lay there, a small monument to the price of surviving, of choosing to stay when everything told you to run. The car disappeared down the winding road, and the cliff fell silent once more.